I always thought that being married for decades meant truly understanding the person next to you. After all, 30 years should teach you everything about someone, right? But one phone call from Joseph shattered that belief, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about my husband, Daniel. Joseph's voice crackled on the other end of the line, sounding unusually strained. "Nancy, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I don't think I can continue sending money for Mom's care much longer." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "What do you mean?" I stammered. "Money for care?" It didn't make sense. "Joseph, what are you talking about? What money?" There was a long pause on the other end before Joseph's voice returned, quieter this time. "You didn't know? I've been sending Daniel $1,500 a month for the past few years to cover Mom's care. He was supposed to give it to you." My stomach twisted in knots. I could hardly breathe. That money had never reached me. I'm Nancy, and I've been married to Daniel for 30 long years. We got married young, both of us just 25 at the time. Now, at 55, I can't help but wonder if those 3 decades were nothing more than a cruel illusion. Back when we first got married, our life was filled with energy. We fought, sure, what couple doesn't? But once the kids were born, our arguments became more intense. Looking back, I thought those fights meant we cared, as if the shouting proved we still had passion for each other. But when the kids grew up and left home, everything changed. The house grew quiet. Too quiet. We stopped talking. The arguments vanished, and with them, the spark in our marriage. Daniel and I became strangers living under the same roof. Now, we sleep in separate rooms, hardly acknowledging each other's existence. I make dinner and leave it outside his door like I'm serving some hotel guest. In return, I get notes, cold, impersonal instructions scrawled on paper. "Dinner was terrible. Make something better tomorrow." Or, "Take my suit to the cleaners by morning." There were no thank yous or conversations, just demands. It was as if he had forgotten I was his wife, not his servant. Despite everything, I still tried. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could rekindle what we'd lost. Now that the kids were gone, I wanted to find a way back to each other, but Daniel seemed to have no interest. The only thing that tied us together anymore was his mother, Sarah. After my father-in-law passed away, we invited Sarah to live with us. She was getting older, and Daniel didn't want her living alone. But over the years, Sarah's health deteriorated. She became bedridden, completely dependent on care. I took on the responsibility of looking after her. Even though she was Daniel's mother, he showed no interest in helping. Sarah was always so apologetic, her sharp mind still intact despite her failing body. "I'm sorry for being such a burden," she'd say. But I didn't see it that way. I had already lost my own parents, so taking care of Sarah felt like the least I could do for the last parent I had. Even when the caregiving got tough, I never complained. The government provided some assistance, and Richard, Daniel's uncle, helped financially. I managed everything while Daniel stayed in his room, barely acknowledging either of us. His own mother, forgotten. When Sarah passed away suddenly, it felt like the world had shifted. I was devastated, but Daniel? He barely seemed to notice. He went through the funeral preparations like it was just another task to complete. No emotion, no sadness, just cold efficiency. I'll never forget what he said at the funeral. After the ceremony, as we were accepting condolences, Daniel turned to one of Sarah's relatives and said, "I'm glad she's gone. She was such a burden." I felt sick to my stomach. How could he say that? Sarah had been nothing but kind to him, to us. And yet Daniel seemed relieved that she was dead. I didn't understand. How could a son be so heartless? The relatives were furious, especially Richard. "You don't mean that," Richard said, his voice barely hiding his anger. But Daniel just shrugged. After the funeral, things got worse. Daniel avoided me even more, speaking only through our children if he needed something. It was like he had completely checked out of our marriage. But worse than the silence was the realization that I had been living with someone I didn't truly know. A month after Sarah's death, life life had become unbearably quiet. With no more caregiving duties, I spent my days trying to distract myself with old detective dramas. They used to be my favorite, but even those couldn't hold my attention anymore. The house felt empty, and I felt emptier still. That's when Joseph called. He hadn't been in the country for years, working overseas while supporting Sarah from afar. But when he mentioned the money, everything changed. "I've been sending Daniel $1,500 a month," Joseph explained, confusion lacing his voice. "He told me it was for Mom's care and the household expenses. You're saying you never saw any of it?" My hands started to tremble. Daniel had never given me a cent of that money. I had been using Sarah's pension and the financial help from Richard to cover her care. And now I knew why Daniel had always been so distant, so cold. He was hiding something big. "I don't know where the money went," I whispered into the phone, my mind racing. Joseph was silent for a moment before he responded. "I think we need to look into this, Nancy. I'll be back in town soon. Let's figure this out together." That night, Daniel didn't come home until the early hours of the morning. By then, my mind was already made up. I had to find out the truth. The next day, after he left for work, I entered his room, something I hadn't done in years. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened his drawers, searching for anything that could explain where the money had gone. And then, I found it. Hidden beneath a pile of papers was a bank statement, one I had never seen before. Every month, $1,500 had been deposited into this account, but almost immediately after each deposit, the money had been withdrawn. All of it. I stared at the statement, my hands shaking. Where had it gone? What had Daniel been spending it on? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. A week later, Joseph arrived in town, and we hatched a plan. We had to confront Daniel, but we needed proof. Joseph had already done some digging and found out something I hadn't expected. Daniel had been spending time at a hotel, regularly, and he wasn't alone. We decided to stake out the hotel, watching from the safety of Joseph's car. Hours passed, and the tension between us grew thick. We were both anxious, waiting for Daniel to show up. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the silence any longer, Joseph nudged me. "There they are," he whispered. I looked up and saw Daniel emerging from the hotel with a woman on his arm. My stomach dropped. The woman was much younger than me, dressed in expensive clothes, her fingers glittering with jewelry. Jewelry that, I suspected, had been bought with the money Joseph had sent for Sarah's care. We got out of the car and approached them. Daniel's face went pale when he saw us. "Nancy? Joseph? What are you doing here?" I crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." Back at the house, Daniel and his mistress, her name was Jessica, sat on the couch, both of them looking nervous. Joseph and I stood over them, armed with the evidence we had gathered. I held up the bank statement. "Daniel, where did the money go?" I demanded, my voice cold and sharp. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Joseph wasn't as patient. "You spent my money on her, didn't you?" he said, his voice filled with anger. "While Nancy was caring for Mom, you were off playing house with Jessica, using the money I sent for Mom's care." Jessica tried to defend herself, but her excuses fell flat. "I didn't know," she stammered. "Daniel told me he was handling everything. I didn't ask questions." I wasn't buying it. "You knew exactly what you were doing," I snapped, pointing to the jewelry she wore. "Those things you're wearing, did you buy them? Or did Daniel?" Jessica looked down, shame spreading across her face. "He bought them for me," she admitted quietly. "I didn't know where the money came from. I'm sorry." The confrontation continued late into the night. Every time Daniel tried to deny his involvement, Joseph and I countered with more evidence. Photos of him and Jessica together, receipts from luxury stores, even hotel bills. There was no way for him to escape the truth. Finally, Daniel broke down. "Yes," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I took the money. I spent it on Jessica. I'm sorry." But his apology meant nothing to me. The betrayal was too deep. For years, I had been the one caring for his mother while he squandered money on an affair. I felt a wave of anger rise within me, stronger than anything I had ever felt before. "This isn't just about the money," I said, my voice shaking. "You lied to me. You abandoned your mother in her final years. And you betrayed our marriage." Daniel couldn't meet my gaze. He mumbled something about being unhappy, about feeling neglected, but I wasn't listening. My mind was already made up. In the end, I filed for divorce. Joseph supported me every step of the way, ensuring that Daniel paid for his actions. Thanks to a skilled lawyer, the process was swift. I received the house and enough financial support to start fresh. Daniel, on the other hand, was left with nothing. Jessica left him soon after, and Daniel's life spiraled into chaos. He lost his job, his savings, Zrenia, and the respect of everyone around him. Meanwhile, I moved on. I sold the house and relocated, determined to start a new chapter in my life. As I settled into my new place, I reflected on everything that had happened. For years, I had felt trapped in a loveless marriage, suffocating under the weight of unspoken resentments. But now, I was free. Joseph, ever the supportive brother-in-law, invited me to visit him overseas. "Come stay with me for a while," he said. "You've earned it." I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to take such a big step. But then I realized that this was my chance to start over, to discover who I was outside of my marriage. And so, here I am, sitting on a plane, heading toward a new adventure. For the first time in years, I feel hopeful. Life is still full of possibilities, and I'm ready to embrace whatever comes next.